Lately, if you are a Libra, you may have been feeling something a little strange. Not exactly hope, but not the same kind of despair either. It feels as if a familiar weight is slowly lifting, even though you cannot quite name what it is yet. The past few months have asked you to stand firm in silence, to hold your balance. While everything around you kept shifting, you became used to enduring, used to saying, "I'm fine," even when, inside, you really were not. But there is a truth that has been quietly coming into view. This difficult chapter cannot stretch on much longer. It has already done what it came into your life to do. And what is about to happen is not here to test you again, but to change the way you see the road you have already walked. If you have been wondering why things lately have begun to move, even if only slightly, then it may be time to listen a little more closely. Because to understand why this phase must end, we have to return to the moment when you reached your limit, the point where everything was forced to change. There are moments in life when you no longer need a clear sign to know you have reached the very edge of a long journey, not because things are falling apart, but because they have become too familiar. For Libra, that feeling of reaching the limit often arrives quietly. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is simply one morning when you wake up and realize you no longer have the energy to keep living the same way. You no longer want to explain yourself. You no longer feel the need to justify, and you no longer try to convince yourself that everything will be fine if you just endure a little longer. The difficult phase you have been moving through may not look the way others imagine. On the surface, you still appear calm. You still fulfill your role. You still try to keep everything in balance. But inside, there were days when you had to tense yourself just to keep things from collapsing. There were nights when you quietly asked what you were really pushing forward for, or whether you were continuing simply because habit would not allow you to stop. And in those deeply personal moments, something subtle began to form. The exhaustion no longer came from circumstances, but from the realization that you had already learned what this chapter was meant to teach you. Not every challenge is meant to last forever. Some chapters exist for a single purpose: to shape your endurance, to sharpen your awareness, to teach you how to remain steady when nothing feels certain. When that purpose is fulfilled, its energy naturally withdraws. There is no need for a dramatic event, no need for a decisive declaration, only a gentle truth, quietly acknowledged, that staying where you are no longer offers anything new to learn. Libra often sees value in giving just a little more time, more patience, more understanding. But there is a delicate line between perseverance and forgetting yourself. When you reach that line, your body and your inner world speak before logic does. You may not be able to name the feeling, but you sense it. In the slowing down, in the way you no longer react as strongly to things that once unsettled you, in the way your questions shift from how to keep going to why you are still going at all. A chapter does not end because you failed within it, but because you walked the path it was meant to open for you. The trials you faced may have taught you how to stand on your own when no one reached out, how to hold your values in places that felt unfair, how to listen to your intuition instead of constantly seeking approval. When those lessons have settled into the way you think, the way you respond, the way you see life, that chapter no longer has a reason to stay. You may not feel completely ready to close it yet. Part of you may still fear change, still worry that letting go will leave nothing behind. But the truth is, Not every empty space is dangerous. Sometimes, it is simply a necessary pause, so you can hear yourself again. And that pause is the sign that this difficult phase has completed its work. When a chapter prepares to close, it does not slam the door shut. It simply makes staying feel less aligned. If you are sensing that now, trust that this feeling is not here to confuse you. It is here to remind you that life does not run on endless endurance. It moves through growth. And when you have grown beyond the chapter that once tested you, ending is not a loss. It is something natural, a necessary transition before what comes next is finally allowed to appear. There is something quietly fascinating that often happens when a person begins to step out of an old state of being. We rarely notice what is leaving. Our attention usually goes to what disappears in visible ways. Money shifts. A relationship no longer feels the same. A familiar role slowly fades. But for Libra, what is quietly withdrawing right now is far more invisible than that. It has no clear shape, no obvious form. It exists as a feeling that has stayed with you for so long. You may have believed it was simply part of who you are. It is the sense that you must always try harder to be worthy. The belief that if you do not push yourself twice as much, you will fall behind. The idea that safety only comes when you keep everyone else balanced before yourself. For a long time, this energy silently shaped the way you made choices, the way you reacted, and the way you measured your own value. You did not question it because it became a mental habit. But lately, you may have noticed something subtle. You no longer feel the same urgency to prove yourself, not because you suddenly have everything, but because something inside you is no longer pushing the way it used to. Your decisions take more time, but they feel steadier. You are less pulled into feelings of lack when you compare yourself to others. And more importantly, you are no longer choosing just to avoid discomfort. This withdrawal does not happen like a clear goodbye. It is more like a thin layer of fog, slowly dissolving. As the light shifts, your circumstances may look the same, but the way you experience them has changed. The things that once made you feel as if you were always at a disadvantage no longer sit at the center of your thoughts. They have not vanished completely, but they no longer decide how you feel. Libra is deeply sensitive to fairness and worth. When you believe you must always do more to arrive at the same place, a sense of scarcity becomes both motivation and burden. It carries you forward, but it also drains you. What is retreating now is not your ambition, but the invisible pressure tied to undervaluing yourself. That pressure once convinced you that only after reaching enough were you allowed to breathe. You may not have a name for this shift yet. You may only sense it through ordinary moments. The moment you decline something that does not feel aligned without guilt. The moment you stop worrying so long about how others see you. The moment you accept that you do not need to appear perfect in every situation. Those small moments are signals that old energy is stepping back, making room for a lighter way of existing. What matters most is that this change does not come from control or forcing yourself to be different. It comes from a depth of fatigue that makes continuing an old pattern no longer possible. When a belief stops serving your growth, it naturally loses weight. And when that weight lifts, you begin choosing from a calmer place within. If you are in this space now, notice what no longer tightens your chest the way it once did. Notice what no longer dominates your thoughts when decisions arise. That is what is quietly leaving. No noise, no announcement, just a gentle shift, opening space for something else to begin forming. And from that space, a new way of living slowly takes shape. There is no rush, only enough truth for you to realize you are no longer being driven by a sense of lack. There is a quiet truth about the most important changes in a person's life. They rarely arrive in the form we expect. There is no clear sign, no announcement, no single moment where everything suddenly makes sense. And you know the page is turned. For Libra, this transition happens in a very subtle way. It does not come with excitement or instant relief. It arrives like a different kind of breath, lighter, deeper, and it often takes time before you realize you are breathing to a new rhythm. You may notice that you begin responding more slowly to situations that once left you unsettled, not because you no longer care, but because you are no longer being pulled by old emotional patterns. There are invitations that once kept you uncertain for a long time. Now, you simply listen inward, and the answer comes. There are concerns that once filled your mind completely. Now, they pass through like a fleeting thought. This shift is not dramatic enough to draw attention, but it is deep enough to redirect the entire flow. Moments of transition often hide inside very ordinary choices. The moment you decide not to explain yourself further, even though you once felt the need to clarify everything. The moment you pause halfway, instead of forcing yourself to push through to the end. The moment you allow yourself to rest without needing a proper reason. These small choices do not look like courage, but they reflect a very real form of maturity. You are beginning to live from the inside rather than reacting to external pressure. What makes this phase so difficult to recognize is that it does not disrupt your current life. You are still there with familiar work, familiar relationships, familiar routines, but the way you show up has changed. You no longer ask yourself if you are good enough every time a decision appears. You no longer adjust yourself constantly to meet invisible expectations. The silence within you has grown steadier, not empty, but deep. Libra is naturally sensitive to the way others see them. For a long time, you may have measured your worth through external responses, through recognition, through the feeling of being accepted. The moment of transition comes when you no longer need those measures to feel that you are on the right path. You still listen, but you no longer depend. You still care, but you no longer trade your inner stability for approval. This is not coldness. It is a new form of self-respect taking shape. This shift also shows itself in the way you face mistakes. Before, each misstep may have led to long self-questioning. Now, you see those experiences as part of a process without rushing to label them right or wrong. You allow yourself to learn instead of punishing yourself, and that attitude creates a much-needed pause where you are no longer trapped in fixing the past and begin paying closer attention to how you move forward. What matters most to understand is that this moment of transition does not ask you to do anything extraordinary. It does not require a sudden change or a symbolic decision. It only asks for honesty with how you feel. When you stop forcing yourself to be an acceptable version When you stop placing yourself into roles that drain you, the shift has already happened, whether you name it or not. If you are in this space now, you may feel slightly disoriented, not because things are falling apart, but because you are no longer standing where you once did. And that feeling is completely natural, because between two familiar shores, there is always a stretch of still water, a place where you do not yet need to know where you are going next. You only need to know that you are no longer where you once grew tired, and it is within that quiet space that the difficult chapter begins to close. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gently enough for you to keep walking forward without carrying the weight of yesterday. There's a very specific moment in every person's journey when you suddenly realize that what once held you back is no longer standing at the center of your life. Not because it has disappeared completely, but because you are no longer seeing life through the same lens. For Libra, this moment often arrives unexpectedly, without a plan, and without any loud breakthrough. It comes on an ordinary day when nothing special seems to be happening, and yet you notice that what once made you hesitate no longer carries the same weight. You may recognize this shift through a very simple situation. A piece of information reaches you by chance. A casual remark unexpectedly touches a blind spot in your thinking, or an opportunity appears at a time you thought you were not ready. What feels unbelievable is not the event itself, but your response to it. You hesitate less than you used to. You no longer spend so much time asking whether you are worthy. You simply realize that you have the right to step forward without asking permission from old limitations. For a long time, you may have believed that circumstances, starting points, or past decisions were what determined your path. Those factors once created a sense of delay, as if life was always one step ahead of you. But then, in a way that is hard to explain, that belief begins to loosen. You look back at what once slowed you down and see that it no longer has the authority to define your future. Not because you deny it, but because you have traveled far enough to understand it was only part of the story, not the whole thing. What makes this moment so difficult to believe is that it goes against what you were once used to. You may have thought that changing direction required tearing everything apart, but in reality, the shift in perspective is surprisingly gentle. It takes nothing away from you. It simply allows you to see possibilities you once refused to consider. You begin to notice that the road ahead was never truly locked by the things you feared. It was only obscured by beliefs that had grown outdated. Libra is naturally careful. With every step forward, you are not someone who acts impulsively. Because of that, when a new truth emerges and reshapes your perspective, its impact runs deep. You may not act immediately, but within you, a new internal order has already been set. You no longer ask whether you are qualified to move ahead. Instead, you begin to wonder what might happen if you stop delaying yourself. This reversal also shows itself in the way you view the past. Missed chances no longer haunt you the way they once did. Periods of slowness are no longer labeled as mistakes. You begin to see that every experience was leading you to this exact moment, not to compensate for anything, but to help you understand the value of where you stand now. And when that understanding settles in, you are no longer bound by the old story of having arrived too late. You may surprise yourself by feeling more open to things that once made you cautious. Not because you have become reckless, but because fear no longer gets to decide for you. A new direction may appear, not as a clear invitation, but as a possibility you never seriously allowed yourself to consider before. And the moment you permit yourself to look that way, a meaningful turning point has already occurred. What truly feels unbelievable is not how quickly life changes, but how differently you now stand before it. When you stop giving control to what once delayed you, the road ahead suddenly feels wider. Not because it is easier, but because you are walking it with a different awareness, an awareness that allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of old limitations. After your perspective begins to shift, something quietly interesting starts to move within a Libra's life. It does not feel like a victory. It does not feel like being favored. It feels more like walking into a familiar room and suddenly realizing the light has changed. Everything is still there, but the way it shows up no longer creates pressure. And in that moment, you understand that you no longer need to fight for balance. It is already finding its way back around you. In the past, you may have been used to keeping everything level, always adjusting, always softening the edges, always stepping back to prevent conflict. But that constant adjustment sometimes caused you to forget that you also belong at the center. When the scale begins to tilt in your favor, the first thing you notice is not abundance, but relief. A lightness spreads when you no longer have to tense yourself to hold everything together. This change shows up clearly in the way you make choices. You no longer stand before each decision with the fear that you might get it wrong. You no longer spend so much time wondering whether your choice will disappoint someone else. Instead, you begin asking whether it fits your rhythm of life and your values. In this season, it is a simple question, but it carries real power. Because when you choose from inner alignment, your surroundings begin to adjust as well. Libra often feels instability when self-worth is placed outside the self. When you measure yourself through outcomes, through recognition, through how needed you are, a sense of safety becomes fragile. But when the scale tilts toward you, a subtle shift takes place. You begin defining your value in your own way, not through distant standards, but through the sense of steadiness that comes from living in alignment with what feels right. You may notice that small fluctuations no longer pull you so strongly. A change in plans does not send you into panic. A delay is no longer interpreted as failure. You allow things to move at their own pace because you are no longer standing in a passive position. When a sense of control returns, it does not show up as power, but as groundedness. You know where you are, and you no longer feel the need to rush, to prove it to anyone. The stability you begin to feel is not stillness. It is the ability to move without losing direction. You have more options, not because opportunities suddenly multiply, but because you no longer confine yourself to old patterns. You allow yourself to consider paths you once overlooked. You widen your perspective without tearing down what you have already built. And that creates the feeling that life is cooperating with you rather than testing you. You may be surprised to find yourself less anxious about the future, not because everything is certain, but because you trust your ability to adapt. You understand that stability does not come from everything going as planned, but from knowing You can adjust. When plans change, when this trust settles in, you stop bracing yourself against life. You begin walking with it. When the scale tilts toward you, the most valuable thing is not what you gain, but how you experience yourself along the way. You no longer feel as if you are constantly compensating or chasing something ahead. You are more fully present in what you do, whether it is large or small. And that presence becomes a steady foundation, one that allows you to keep moving forward without having to strain, to stay balanced anymore. When an old chapter begins to close, the hardest part is not stepping into a new page, but letting go of the familiar version of yourself. For Libra, that version may be someone who learned how to carry weight, how to endure quietly, how to move through heavy seasons without showing much on the surface. You lived in that role long enough to believe it was the only way you could exist. But as things begin to shift, you are being invited to do something different, not to become a completely new person, but to allow a lighter version of yourself to step into the light. What you are asked to do now is not found in a big action or a symbolic decision. It lives in permission. Permission to stop reacting from old habits. Permission to release the image that once helped you survive a difficult phase. Some versions of us exist only to carry us through a certain stretch of road. When that road ends, holding on to that version only makes the journey heavier. You may feel unfamiliar without the pressure you once knew so well. There may be moments when you wonder whether you are becoming passive, but the quiet inside you is not a sign of giving up. It is a sign of trust beginning to form. Trust that you do not need to control everything for life to move forward. Trust that you can walk ahead without constantly looking back. This new phase does not require you to understand the entire picture. It only asks that you do not turn away from the subtle signals appearing in everyday life. A sense of calm when you make a choice, clarity around what you no longer wish to continue, a gentle steadiness. When small changes arise, these signals are not here to test you, but to guide you to move slowly in your own rhythm. Libra often tends to question whether you have done enough, whether you are worthy enough. But as the old chapter closes, those questions no longer hold center stage. What is coming next does not ask you to prove anything. It does not require you to be better than someone else, faster than someone else, or more perfect than anyone else. It only asks that you be fully present with what you have learned and with what you are ready to lay down. You may find yourself standing before choices that no longer feel tense. You no longer weigh every step between gain and loss. You listen to yourself more clearly, and that listening allows you to move forward with a very different kind of steadiness. Not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because you trust your ability to adjust if needed. This trust is not loud, but it is deep enough to change the way you live. As you close the old chapter, notice what you are still carrying that no longer serves you, not to blame the past, but to create space. For the present, that space is not emptiness. It is room for something new to enter, without comparison, without doubt. And within that space, you begin to live more lightly, more honestly, and closer to who you truly are. In the end, What matters most is not where you are going, but how you walk after everything you have lived through. If you allow yourself to loosen the grip on old identities, if you trust that change does not need to be fully understood from the beginning, then you are ready, not for a specific result, but for a different journey. A journey where you no longer need to strain, to stay balanced, because you have become the ground your life can stand on.